The next question has probably been bothering you ever since very early on in the previous lecture. Namely, if valid arguments can have false premises, then what good are they? Sure, there's this technical logician's notion of a valid argument, but why should we care whether arguments are valid if valid arguments can be really bad? Validity might be necessary for an argument to be good, or at least for a deductive argument to be good, because remember, there are also inductive arguments. But even though it's necessary, it's not enough. You can have a horrible argument that's still valid. Well, the great thing about validity is that when you add true premises to a valid argument, then you get something that really is valuable, which we're going to call a sound argument. Because if you know that the premises are true, and you also know that it's not possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false, then you know the conclusion must be true. So in a sound argument, the conclusion has to be true. And that is what makes it valuable. Because if we can get a deductive argument to be sound, then you really got something. What you've got is a true conclusion. Officially then, a sound argument is one where the premises are true and the argument is valid. And we've got the same combinations of truth and falsity as possibilities that we had in valid arguments. You can have both premises and conclusion are true, and then if it's valid, the argument's sound, and if it's not valid, it's not. Or you can have the premises are true and the conclusion's false, and then it can't be valid, but if it's invalid, it's not sound. Or you can have the premises are false and the conclusion's true, and then if it's valid, it's not sound, and if it's invalid, it's not sound. Or you can have both the premises and the conclusion are false, and then it's not going to be sound whether it's valid or not. So the only combination where it's sound is when the premises are true and the argument is valid, and in that case, you know that the conclusion is true. What about lack of soundness? Well, there are two ways for an argument to fail to be sound, namely, either the argument can be invalid or one of its premises can be false. So it's a lot easier for an argument to be unsound. And we know that a deductive argument tries to be valid, and of course it wants its premises to be true, so a deductive argument is trying to be sound, and when it fails to be sound, it's not going to be any good. Now the next question is, how can you know? If you don't know whether the premises are true, you're not going to know whether the argument's sound. Well, not quite, because if the argument's valid and you know it's valid, then you don't know whether it's sound unless you know the premises are true. But if you know the argument's invalid, you already know it's unsound, even if you don't know whether the premises are true. So if you think about it, that shows why you want to be able to test for validity. Because if you can show the argument's invalid, then you're going to be able to say, well, I know it's unsound, regardless of what you think about whether the premises are true or not. So there's going to be some value to validity. Namely, if you can show it's invalid, you're going to show it's unsound, and that means that the deductive argument didn't get what it wanted. So validity is going to be necessary for soundness, and soundness is going to be important because it guarantees the truth of the conclusion. And then validity derives its value from the fact that if it's not valid, it's not sound. Okay, now there's a lot more to say about validity, and we'll say a lot more about validity when we get to formal logic in the second part of this course. But for now, we're just going to stick with this pretty intuitive notion of validity and see how we can use this notion of validity to reconstruct arguments.